I'm talking to Joshua Leifer. Joshua Leifer is a journalist, editor, and translator. His essays have been featured far and wide across many publications, and he's currently pursuing his PhD at Yale University. Josh is also the author of Tablets Shattered: The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life. This book is quite a phenomenon. It's new and it's being talked about extensively in the Jewish world. Just yesterday, I visited some friends randomly in the Bronx and we had breakfast together. And I said, "Oh, by the way, have you heard of this book?" Of course. Everyone is reading it. They had read it and they had a lot to say about it. Um, I recommended this to the rabbi of my shul. The rabbi of my shul promptly read it and then he talked about it from the pulpit at his sermon. I've lent this book out to people, and there's a waiting list of people who want this book. I've bought copies of the book to people. I tell people this is the best nonfiction Jewish book I've read, and I mean that. Besides being an astounding work of like great history with great content, it's also so well written. Which, as someone who does some of these interviews, I'm very sensitive to that, because not only does it make the reading experience better, but also enhances, I think, it speaks volumes about the quality of what you're reading as well. So anyway, that's just my off the cuff sense of gratitude for you and this book, which is a book I know I'm going to revisit and I know I'm going to continue to recommend to people. And yeah, I would recommend to anyone watching this, Jewish or non-Jewish, who wants to learn about the history of Judaism in America and what that means. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm completely flattered and bowled over by the praise that
But
you
you
gave the
must
book.
know that this has caused quite a stir. I mean, you must feel the sense that you're at the center of a bit of a moment right now in the Jewish world.
It's one of those things where it's hard to always have a sense of what's happening. And I think that, and this is something we can get into because of the politics of the book on Israel Palestine and the left. Like my primary preoccupation has been like kind of criticism from the left, and maybe I've lost sight a little bit of what's happening within the more, like, I guess, straightforward Jewish world. I mean, I have some sense because I get emails from people, but I am very heartened to hear what you said, and also very grateful that you think so highly of the book and invited me
Yeah.
to talk to you.
It's also I would say within the people that I talk to, I mean, I don't consider it controversial. I just love it. But I talk to people who have, who consider it controversial, who disagree with a lot of it, which I think is part of the beauty. And it's written with a real sense of, I would say, moral fiber, of conviction, not shying away from difficult topics, not shying away, not afraid to make statements and make judgments that are, that are well informed and well researched. And so again, that's part of, I think, what makes it such a unique and compelling book.
I mean, it was meant to be it was meant to be disagreed with. And one of the things that I felt actually was that um, there are of course a lot of books about American Jewish life, but they tend to have kind of like a self-help or a you know everything goes sort of quality to them. And I thought, well, that's nice. There's a place for agreeability, absolutely, but maybe there's also a place for argument. I mean, we haven't had enough argument, and that's part of why we are where we are. Um,
Yeah. So maybe you could just share a few words about the genesis of the book. So sort of what inspired you to write this book and maybe some of your process, because of course it is such a well-researched and complete kind of involved text.
Sure. I mean, the initial seed of the book grew out of an article that I wrote, and that was published in a very small magazine called The Baffler in March of 2020, right before the pandemic. And that article, which I haven't looked at in years, and I'm sure there would be things that I take issue with or disagree with a little bit, and how I articulated things in retrospect, but it was an attempt to understand the politics of American Jewish life in the Trump moment and what had led up to led up to the particular kinds of polarization and new forms of Jewish politics that we were seeing then. And I actually didn't propose the book per se, but an editor and an agent reached out and were looking for a book that was about American Jewish disillusionment with Israel. And I auditioned the proposal. And in the end, they accepted it, but with some substantial changes. Initially, I wanted to take stock of what had happened to Jewish life over the Trump years. I thought that tendencies that maybe had been brewing before then had kind of flowered or come into better view. Um, yeah, I wanted to provide a roadmap. And then when I submitted that proposal, my editor said, this is good, but actually you need to have more of a story here. You need a little bit more of a personal element to it. You need character. You need existential stakes, meaning and so I went back and rewrote it, and that's where the book's narrative spine came from, which starts with my own family story and my great grandmother's arrival in the U.S. from her shtetl in what's now Belarus, and then um, my narration of the changes in American Jewish life through the various stages that my family experienced. It occurred to me also as I was writing that, on the one hand, it was partly a formal decision, like a formalistic decision in the sense that readers need a narrative to glom onto, and the personal is often a very good one to use. But the other was a kind of, in a sort of fortuitous or coincidental way, my own family story um, was shaped by some of the kind of pivotal moments in American Jewish history. And so it was kind of easy to narrate those changes um, through the way that I understood them, kind of using the family experience to branch out into a bigger, more expansive historical narrative.
Yeah. And what I really resonated with was the sense of like, by telling this history, by telling this family story, you're answering the question like, how do we get here? There's a part in your book which I really resonated with where you talk about like your father's bookshelf, you know, and I was like, yes, yes, like those are the books on my father's bookshelf, and why? Like, why are those the books? You know,
Exactly.
um,
Yes.
I don't have it open in front of me, but like Moshe Dayan and
Yeah,
and
the
and
Moshe
and
Dayan biography.
the history of the Jews and all these things. And um I remember when I was very young, my parents fed me VHS tapes, which probably most, the kind of VHS that everyone had, like I had the Disney, and I also had like Six Day War documentary VHS tapes, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
In black and white. And there's just this question of like how did we get here? And it's an investigation I think that you're doing and that I do vicariously by reading it is like why are my parents the way they are? Why are my grandparents
Yes.
the way they are? My grandfather who was very dear to us, who was born in America, who passed not long ago, like what was his Jewish life like, and all that is there. And it's so rich and it feels so urgent.
Yeah, it's funny. There was a moment when I was writing the book where I thought to myself, in a way, the process of writing, and I hope also the publication of the book itself, was a way into an intergenerational dialogue. Um, that I wanted to. I think like when you're young and you are an activist or you have opinions, you kind of relate to your parents' views or your grandparents' views or the older generation's views, a certain kind of antagonism. Like they made the world messed up and now it's our job to fix it. And I wanted to think a little bit differently about the relationship to the past and to say, well, what would it mean to inhabit their world and to take their experiences seriously and on its own terms, and like what might be learned in doing that, but also what might be gained just in terms of an understanding, like you said, of how we got to where we are. I mean, that was really, as the book came together, that became the primary goal, or one of the primary goals, of just explaining how we got to where we are.
Yeah. And I'm definitely the kind of person who inhabits that has the instinct towards, our parents messed it up. But I think for other people, the opposite is true. And there's a sense of what is now always was, that this is
Right.
perfect and this is idealized and this is what Judaism is, this is what American Judaism is. And there's no sense of the evolutions, of the change, of the progress, of the anxieties. And one of the things a good book of history does, I mean, I'm only 36 years old, but so much stuff like, oh my God, I remember this. Like I
Right.
remembered, the anxieties that were palpable in the community about intermarriage and about like the loss of Jewish life and all these
Right.
things.
Yeah,
And yeah,
totally. Totally. I mean, that was one of the other things. Initially, I am a journalist by profession, and I'm a graduate student in history, so methodologically inclined to history and the norms of history writing. And what both of those fields have in common is they tend to shy away from the personal and the personal narrative and the personal pronoun I. But it occurred to me that because like I had lived through some of the things the book was going to be covering, that it actually was more honest to just be like, well, this is where I was when this was happening, and this is how I understood it at the time, and this is how I understand it differently now, and that it would actually make the book more relatable than kind of narrating it from like the outside, omniscient, like God's eye historian's view of just like explaining process through the whole through the whole thing.
yeah, and I'm thinking now as we're talking, just that this 100 or so years of American Jewish life, which you describe in sort of your own autobiographical terms, and I can also map onto my own family's history in America, um, also parallels a real evolution in just America in general. The book opens with the radical roots of a Jewish immigrant population. Um, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I see echoes of that in like the Bernie Sanders of American
For sure.
politics, or the Noam Chomsky, this really radical Jewish American instinct from an older generation, and to today, which evolved. There was a labor movement in America, which the Jewish community was very involved in, and then there was the Reagan era, and it leads us today to Trumpism. Where Trump is now our president-elect, and I just feel like America went through something, and the Jewish community went through something in parallel, and there's sort of like that dual narrative there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was obviously write about Jews and our history, but also to use the Jewish experience in America as a way of talking about broader changes in America and also in the world. And you're totally right that Bernie and Noam Chomsky are kind of these remnants or his artifacts of an older kind of Jewishness that actually was, if not dominant, then one of the dominant ways of being Jewish in America, which is to say, like connected to labor organizations. I mean, as I described in the book, like my father's mother, my bubby, grew up. I mean, she grew up in a religious family, but became a kind of Yiddish socialist and was involved in the workman's circle, the Arbiter Ring, and she met my grandfather at their sleepaway camp, Camp Kindering, and for her, there was a kind of seamlessness between her progressive politics and her Yiddishkeit. And that part of the story, on the one hand, you could tell the story of what happened over the last century as the formation of what we know as American Jewish identity, and then it's kind of its gradual the gradual erosion of its specificity or its uniqueness or its distinctiveness. But you could also tell a story about, well, part of what happened was that the political project that Yiddishkeit was attached to, namely socialism, also died during this time period. And yes, and part of the remnants of that, like I think there are a lot of scholars who ask the question, like, why are Jews such loyal Democrats? Like, what is it about American Jews who vote, contrary to, well, maybe less so these days, but because of the way education polarization has happened. But like for a long time, the question was, why are American Jews, who are generally more affluent than your average American, why are they such loyal Democrats? And I think that part of that is that they're a kernel of this older Jewishness has survived. I mean, the vast majority of American Jews today in America, their ancestors came over in this big wave of immigration starting in the 1880s and ending in 1924. And not all of those people were like Yiddish radicals, but there was a very, very big Yiddish left-wing culture. in New York and elsewhere in newspapers. The Forward is an example of that, but there were lots of others. And I think the commitment to social justice that a lot of American Jews find instinctive, and that when you ask them, like in surveys like the Pew survey, it's one of the things that comes up at first, second, or third. And like, what does it mean to be a Jew? It means to care about doing good in the world, which is a good thing, but also is a very particular way of thinking about Jewishness that isn't the only meaning that Jewishness has ever had in the world and in history.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna try an experiment that might fail. I wanted to read a quote from the book, and I had some prepared, but now the bookmarks got a little mixed up. So we're gonna see, like when you sometimes you open the Bible, just like a Bible quote. We're gonna see if this experiment pans out. So I have the quote here in front of me, and this is just this is basically opened at random, so to speak. I mean, I have some bookmarks here. I opened them. I just want to see where I would find, and I just this is sort of typical, I think, of the themes and you know that we're exploring. And if I read a little bit too long, I'll cut some of it out in post, so it's not such a long quote. But you're talking about the way in which America experienced the Holocaust, where American Jews at this time are upwardly mobile, um, let's say, or they're doing well, they're comfortable relative to their brethren that they left behind in Europe, and news
Yes.
is starting to trickle in of what happened, this utter destruction of European Jewry. And I think, I mean, the book discusses this, and I think intuitively Jews in America, I think, have some sort of understanding that that is really the formative wound of our identity, and that trauma very much casts a long shadow over our experience in America today. And so this is your writing, on this topic. Um, the hyperactive production of Holocaust literature, film, and even kitsch that has characterized American Jewish life over the last quarter century is the result of this anxiety about how precisely to remember. It is not just a fear that the terrible events might be forgotten, or that the ignorant and the anti-Semitic cease to believe the Holocaust happened. It is instead a deep, abiding, and almost definitional uncertainty about how American Jewry should relate to a tragedy that did not befall it but could have. As Peter Novick observed, perhaps the last commonality shared by the vast majority of American Jews is the knowledge that but for their parents, or more often grandparents or great-grandparents' immigration, they would have shared the fate of European Jewry. I'm skipping now ahead, but the centrality of the Holocaust has also enabled the indefinite deferral of articulating reasons for continued Jewish identification on more positive grounds, leading to a crisis of meaning. A community cannot survive on what it remembers, the sociologist Will Herberg wrote. It will persist only because of what it affirms. End quote. So that's let's talk a little bit about the Holocaust and Holocaust memory, and how you think about that, and how that sort of exists today, and affected sort of the trajectory of American Judaism.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's funny. I gave a presentation to an Israeli audience actually a few days ago about the book, and one of the things that came up was they thought that I hadn't dealt enough with the Holocaust, which I thought
Funny.
was
That makes me laugh. Yeah, that's very funny.
yeah, which is a very typical but also funny thing
Yeah.
to have heard it. But I think that I wanted to use the academic term, kind of like problematize the place of the Holocaust in American Jewish identity, because, and it's also the reason why I didn't choose it as one of the pillars of the American Jewish consensus. I mean, in the book, I argue that the post-war American Jewish consensus was comprised of these three pillars: Americanism, Zionism, and liberalism. And in some sense, like, I think I write this too, like the Holocaust is sort of the mortar that holds them all together, in the sense that America looks exceptionally good, certainly in comparison to what happened to Jews in the other countries that they lived in, and also that Zionism and Israel's need to exist is confirmed again by the Holocaust, and also that liberalism and the open society and tolerance and a neutral public sphere and all these other things. These are the necessity of like a liberal worldview is confirmed again by the experience of the Holocaust. But all that being said, I think that in like the fabric of American Jewish life, certainly when I was growing up, the Holocaust stood in for a lot of or occupied a place, such a big place that there wasn't that much that accompanied it. I mean, this is related to what I'm saying, but as I've been talking about the book to different audiences, I've gotten questions from kind of like an older generation who will say things like, I loved reading your book, but my children are not interested in Judaism, and where did I go wrong, and what can I do to bring them back? And one of the things I realized when I was trying to answer those questions is that I think if you grew up like me in what I call the mainstream affiliated Jewish world, day school, federation, etc., you get a strongly felt Jewish education, but not an especially deep one. And um, and so you feel very much maybe the burden of history and the Holocaust, certainly the connection to Israel, but those things don't necessarily give you a guide of how to be Jewish in your day-to-day life, say, or um, I think maybe not, maybe for us, our people our age, but certainly not for younger, it might be, but younger people, it's harder, but like the continuity argument is less compelling. There's this famous Jewish theologian, Emil Fackenheim, who famously in an essay wrote about the 614th mitzvah,
Mm,
what he coined, which is not to give Hitler any posthumous victories.
right.
And that was kind of viewed as both a sort of skepticism of intermarriage and an argument for continuity. I think in today's America, that's less of a potent reason. And so the crisis of, well, what are the reasons for remaining Jewish and being Jewish and caring about the future of Judaism? I think that people are starting to ask those questions now because we're in another moment of like crisis and confusion, but for a long time they kind of were avoided.
Totally, totally, totally. And what everything you're saying resonates with my own experience and life. So I attend an Orthodox Jewish synagogue here in Westchester, and there's an older woman who's responsible for reading the birthdays at the Kiddush at the thing every week. And she says, the greatest victory we can have over the Nazis is another birthday, or something like that. That's her thing. It's her
Exactly.
line every month she says
Right.
that. But
Right.
this deep sense of um this anxiety of persistence, this anxiety of living another year or whatever, being Jewish, persisting Judaism, but also this void, this vacuum of what that means. What I'm saying, of a lack of a positive definition. I think that's like an example of that. It feels very, very alive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about another amazing moment in the book. So many amazing moments. This is just another typical amazing moment in the book. Aleph Bet Yoshua, A.B. Yoshua,
Yeah.
um, an Israeli author, is on a panel with other American authors, from what I understand,
Yes.
and he has some strong words. Can you tell that episode over what happened there?
Yeah, it became a kind of infamous episode in like Israel diaspora relations. And then the funny thing is that the it kind of inaugurated a genre of like um, Israeli or Jewish intellectuals interacting with kind of like Jewish professionals, in which Jewish professionals would go to hear them speak and then be like admonished by them for their inadequacies. I think of someone, I mean, I don't know if he's one of your listeners, but like Danny Gordis also played a rabbi who lives in Jerusalem now, as a conservative rabbi. He often plays this role of kind of like a liberal Jewish organizational audience go to him and he like tells them the way that they're like falling short in their Jewish obligations. But basically, Abi Yehoshua or Aleph Bet Yehoshua is on this panel in 2006 at the centenary event for the American Jewish Committee, one of the big American Jewish organizations. On the panel with him are an interesting panel, is the novelist Cynthia Ozick, is the editor and journalist writer Leon Wieseltier, and also the mystic Talmud scholar, translator of the Talmud into Hebrew, Rabbi Dean Steinsaltz. And Abi Yehoshua goes kind of on this rant where he starts to compare the difference between what being Jewish in Israel means and what being Jewish in America means. And he says things like, in Israel, being Jewish is my skin, but in the America, being Jewish is a jacket that you can take on and off. And then in Israel, being Jewish is like being married to the Jewish people. But in the diaspora, being Jewish is like playing around with the Jewish people. And he goes on and on this on this line and basically argues, which is an argument that like a lot of Zionist thinkers made for a long time, but that the only way to have a full, total form of Jewish experience is to live in a sovereign Jewish state. And he has one other line that I think that I pick up in that chapter that I really liked, which is that because I felt like it posed a challenge that rang true, even if I didn't want to agree at the time with the Yehoshua's argument. And he says that Judaism is not some spice box that you open once a week and like sprinkle onto things. It has to be, in Israel like that's what it's like in the diaspora, but in Israel by contrast, Jewishness is matters of life and death. And as I got older and started to, went to college, became an activist and a journalist and everything, I was like, well, maybe, I often went back to the speech that he gave because I was around a lot of people who were saying like, we're doing something new, in Jewish, we're making new kinds of Jewish identity. But I felt like sometimes it felt a little thin to me. And I thought, well, I often thought of Baby Yehoshua's challenge in that way. Like, were we just taking Judaism out of a spice box and say, sprinkling it on our protest or sprinkling it on, I don't know, something we would normally do anyway, but just we wanted to feel Jewish about it. And I think I come down very strong in one way in the book, but there are days when I have doubts about whether that was the right position. I'm still pretty confident that I think like his critique still does ring true for a lot of Jewish life. Certainly like non-Orthodox, non-practicing Jewish life, although also forms of Orthodoxy do this too. So it's not like they get a jail out of free card. But yeah, so I don't know if that opens up into where you were thinking of going with the with Aleph Ben Yehoshua
Yeah, I want to sit
book.
with this a little bit. I want to sit with this. I mean, it's an argument that I've heard from my family members, and probably to be perfectly honest, although it's painful to admit, it's an argument that I believed, in a sense of like when I was living in Israel at the time and studying, I really felt superior. Like this is it.
Mhm.
And I think like what you're saying, there's a kind of truth to that in a sense. Like there is a sense of like Israel is like this Jewish utopia in a way, it's because it is a Jewish state, what you might call an ethno state. It's a homogenous, religiously, whatever, sort of directed project.
Right.
And I think what's sort of startling is that there's just such a tension between the experience of believing in that utopian vision and the ideas of this is my full expression and manifestation of Judaism, but there's also a dark side to that. There's also if you're an insider, if you buy into this utopia, then that's like the best thing in the world. But if you're an outsider, there's something very dark about that. There's something very limited about that. In the modern world, in a post World War II world, of we try to, I think, preserve and protect and champion the values of liberal democracy, which are antithetical to uh,
Right.
this strong marriage of religion and nationhood.
Right. I think that um, one of the like Israel and Israel's existence and Zionism's success in the sense of its creation of the state that intended to create really was a profound revolution in the history of Jewish life and poses really serious challenges into the prior conceptions of Jewish identity that existed. And I think that for those of us who grew up outside of Israel, you know, in different ways, I know this is true of myself, like there's an allure and an attachment and even a romanticization of the Jew as the marginal. We were marginal for so long, we were oppressed so for long, we know what it's like to be a minority. Out of that experience, we produced, a kind of amazing corpus of thought and thinking. I mean, Hannah Arendt writes about this when she talks about um, the the conscious pariah and the Jew as the pariah, and the creativity that the experience of marginalization in Europe gave rise to. And there is something in that, if that's your understanding of what it means to be Jewish, then the creation of a state where Jews are the ethnic, ethno-religious majority and a state with a powerful army that is, in perpetual war with its neighbors, and um, there's something very uncomfortable, uh, very uncomfortable about it. I mean, I think that, or to put it in another way, for a long time, as I moved back and forth between, and also lived in Israel for a time, like I think there was a period of time where I lived in Israel and I was very bothered by this contrast. Um, and I've come to think of it this way, in the sense that my sense of being Jewish was kind of like, being what it means to be Jewish is to be Yaakov Ish Tam, is to be Jacob, the dweller of tents, the learner, the gentle person, the non-war maker, to not be part of this kind of apparatus of violence. And the argument that Zionism makes is that the world in which we live, certainly in the lesson of the Holocaust, is that it's not enough to be, if you want to survive, you can't just be Yaakov Ish Tam. You have to exercise power. You have to do these things. And I think, like, does that constitute, it does constitute a profound reconceptualization of what it means to be Jewish. There were times when I thought it was a tragedy. There are also times where I'm like, well, I'm glad it exists. I'm glad that that Jews managed to survive and create a state. And I think, like, yeah, there's an ambivalence there at the theoretical level about what the Jewish practice of realpolitik has meant for being Jewish in the world. You're muted. Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah. I think that's sort of the story in a way of Zionism, of course, but this complete redefinition, this retransformation of what it means to be Jewish. And this, I think is what the book covers and highlights so well, is that the centerpiece of Judaism transformed. It changed, especially in America. And just this question of what, like you're saying, the pendulum swung, or this something snapped in the center of mass, let's say, in the mainstream perspective of what Judaism says about power. Something tremendously, completely transformed. And you talk about in the book the sense of, like, how in America there's this vicarious living through Israel, that Israel becomes the centerpiece of religious thought in a lot of ways. It certainly becomes a centerpiece in the liturgy and the talking about, for sermonizing in America. And this, an example that I think of from my own personal life, I have brothers who, served in the army and live in, when they come back to America, as like now, like, they're hardened Israelis, like it's like they did like a transformation. And then, like, the Americans in synagogue, they're like in awe of them. They say, "Oh, hello, welcome." And it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm, like, really not exaggerating. There's, like, the sense of, like, this like heroic Israeli Jew that we sort of idolize and live vicariously through. And so I think all that is sort of going on with this. And then maybe, yeah, coming back to A.B. Yehoshua again, this sense of the pointing the finger is very powerful. There's this sense that I think American Jews can't criticize. And I think we've learned that in all sorts of ways. There's this deep internalized sense that we can't criticize Israel. It's like, take it or leave it if you're in America. Does that sound accurate to you? Do you agree with that?
I mean, I think that that's changed a lot because are so many Jewish critics of Israel now. But certainly, I think within the kinds of community that I grew up in, to criticize Israel was basically to be seen as disloyal. And I actually think that part of the more radical expressions of criticism of Israel now maybe would have been, like, less radical if there had been more of a space for what I would call, like, a normal relationship to Israel. In other words, this always used to drive me nuts, but growing up and having gone to a school that was half in Hebrew and having Hebrew language skills, I was always like, the things that you can say in Hebrew are much harsher about Israel than you can say in English. Like, if you read Haaretz in Hebrew and then you look at, like, the discourse in America, it's night and day. And I always wanted to be like, well, don't you understand? Like, these people aren't I don't think, I mean, there are people who argue this, but, like, the journalists who write for Haaretz are not anti-Semites.
Right.
even if they have strong foundational critiques of what Israel is doing. But because there was no space for this, and still isn't enough space for this in most American Jewish communities, I think that people who found themselves having really strong moral doubts or criticisms of what Israel is doing, on their way out, basically. Uh,
Yeah. And just to give a sense of how I don't know, I mean, just how bizarre this is and extreme this is and alienating it is for me. For example, my 9-year-old son is very very precocious and intelligent. He knows that we were very supportive of Kamala in the most recent election, and he comes home and says, my friends tell me that Kamala is an anti-Semite. Because that's sort of the deep level of internalized fear or trauma or extremism or radicalism, black and white thinking that it comes
right.
to. We've gotten to, I think, in the Orthodox Jewish world when it comes to thinking about Israel. And I mean, it's I don't know what to call that. It's just shocking, I would say, but that's just the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it, generously interpreted, we should ask, what are people who can't hear criticism so afraid of? Like, what do they think is going to happen if, you're allowed to voice a foundational criticism of Israel, or even a criticism, or just, or a criticism of Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza, which, and I think that they're actually like, if you, maybe not, it depends on what community you're in, but if you ask a lot of American Jews, what do they like when they see what's on the news in Gaza and they see the devastation, they see the lines of people being forced out of their homes and, before tons of rubble. Like, do they feel they probably like, I think a lot of people actually feel ashamed that this is what Israel is doing, but there's a mental block there that prevents them from looking at the reality. And then I think there you get into all this kind of like weird denialism and the kind of the world of alternate facts also that like I think a lot of American Jewish communities live in, where there is a refusal, a deep psychological refusal to look at reality. I remember I had a conversation with a friend's father once. I was describing him to the system, I had been working as a reporter in the West Bank, and I went to tell him about policing. He says, if the things that you're saying are true, then this sounds to me like apartheid. But what you're saying to me is not true. And I was like, okay, so you are living with this person is a person who's living with a deep dissonance, and his psychological investment in Israel as kind of morally uncriticizable is so high that he just cannot look at reality in its face.
Yeah, and coming back to that A.B. Yoshua quote again, I think that for better or for worse, religion creates all sorts of protections against criticism and curiosity and all sorts of things that could lead to uh, threatening, religious ideology. And you can say that's a feature of beautiful religious communities if you want, or you could say it's a problem, whatever. But there's this deep marriage of I think religion and politics in the modern, certainly Orthodox Jewish world, but I don't probably other parts of the Jewish world that I'm just less intimately familiar with. And when you have that marriage, I think in general, since we're Jewish, we say it just is what it is. But I think if it was a non-Jewish marriage, if it was a Christian state with Christian that kind of politics, we would say that that's dangerous. We would say that that's troubling. So that's the way I see it. You know.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, what you're saying, I think, is very true about the merger of politics and religion, and it's not just in the sense of Israel as a kind of not just a ethnic nation state, but also as a kind of like very light form of religious state. People often ask me, like, when I ask strangers, they're like, well, what is Israel like? I'm like, well, think of a combination of Yugoslavia and Iran. And that gives you a little bit of a sense of like the different cultural strands of that are at play in Israel. But in terms of politics and religion, I think one of the changes that I did that I tracked in the book that became much clearer during the Trump years was the um, the very fast and um, merger of religious expression with contemporary political concerns. Like, for a long time, your kind of average rabbi had been like, I don't talk about politics from the pulpit, sort of. And over the last decade or so, that's basically changed, both in liberal and in, not liberal congregations. So in liberal congregations, you'll get a kind of like social justice Torah and a very strong emphasis on, supporting whatever like the cause of the day is, and then in right wing or some Orthodox, congregations, you'll get a much more kind of right wing. Like, I mean, it was very striking that there was that letter circuit or some letter circulated. I don't know if I got it right. If I'm going to get it right, that was like, if people in your community voted for Kamala Harris, like they shouldn't be able to have like an Aaliyah or things like that, like some kind of like pseudo excommunication topic. This is all signs of something I think relatively new in American Jewish life, which is the way that politics has penetrated into the synagogue, and there's not a dividing line anymore. Whereas if there was something that characterized like religious life in the 1950s, it was like there's religion, there's politics on the side, and there's like these two separate spheres. It's very important to maintain the separation of these spheres.
Yeah, I mean, the section you have on Trump there, I think, is really rich. The Jewish Orthodox Jewish relationship to Trump. Let's not go there now. I think is enough we can dig into.
Yeah.
One of my favorite parts of the book, I thought, was really just. I mean, again, I the whole book was so good, but a part that really stuck with me is when you get towards the end and you think about the path forward and the um, you sort of paint this picture that we're sort of standing on a real transition moment in American Jewish history. The future is unknown. There's different visions about what the future of American Jewish life could be like, should be like. There's sort of a looking back, a taking stock of sort of what these Jewish institutions have built and the ways in which they're no longer, serving those functions that people thought maybe they would be serving. So can you speak to that a little bit? Like where are we, and what does the future look like, and how do you think about the different paths?
Yeah, so it's funny. My editor asked me to write that last chapter because by virtue of being a journalist and a historian, I'm like the future, the present, and the past, I'm okay with, but the future is it's I don't have any. I'm not a prophet. I don't have any special
Well,
insight
that's a relief because a lot of
into.
people are very confident in their future predictions, and I think with confidence comes a kind of a myopia, that which this book didn't suffer from. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, like that's sort of where I think when you spend a lot of time thinking about the past and seeing how people's past interpretations about the future turned out to be wrong, it does inculcate a little bit of a sense of humility in that, like, one, there's a high level of unpredictability, but two, when you're living in a moment, it's very easy to overestimate the amount of like rupture or change that you're experiencing. Um, and that in the longer run or in the longue durée, as historians say, like it actually might not be that significant. And also as human beings, I think when we're in a time period or a moment that feels uncomfortable, we want a resolution to it. And one of the feelings, I don't know if I drew it out enough in the book, what that I wanted to touch on was, yeah, we're in a very confusing moment, a moment of realignment, a moment of flux. The decline of the denominations that once structured American Jewish life, like conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, and their seminaries not playing a big role in their rabbi, there's a shortage of all of these things. But that doesn't mean that the situation that we find ourselves in will be resolved like in our lifetime necessarily, or even our children's lifetime. Like these things can actually go on for a really long time. And more, I actually feel like there's this sort of overarching structure of the challenge of American Jewish identity in like post 1967 America, where Jews are associated with Israel as an occupying power on the world stage, and it puts them at odds with, let's say, like a coalition of other marginalized people in America who are part of a struggle for social justice. And a lot of the lines that like you heard in the late 60s that say leaders of the Black Power movement said in their criticisms of Zionism in Israel would be totally fit into the kind of like critique today that parts of the left have of Israel. And like, in other words, like this might be a long structure. Like 50 years is a long time. It's also not that long a time. But anyway, that's all of a preface to basically like the past that I did see emerging from this moment, or that even exists now in this moment. One of them is the kind of that the establishment institutions, like I alluded to before, they're not going anywhere, even as they lose a lot of the people a lot of their kind of mass base that they had, say, in mid-century. they'll be around for a long time. And the suburban synagogues that exist, people will still go to them, even if fewer people go to them. A lot of them, can't make regular minyan or whatever, but like they're around and they'll be around for a while. Federation, all that stuff. Another option that I think has emerged is what I call in the book prophetic protest, and this is kind of the young, like the youth-led Jewish social justice movements that see the expression of their Judaism in protest. It's the Jews who were at the encampments at the universities, or and sometimes like the essence of their Judaism even is, in a counterintuitive way for a lot of people, is like they'll say this to you, like what it means to be Jewish just to stand in solidarity with Palestinians. Like it's a Jewish identity that's based on kind of standing with the underdog, fighting injustice wherever that may be, without necessarily regard for another overarching idea of like Jewish peoplehood. Like that's not the important thing in that articulation of Jewish identity. The third path, which is related a little bit, is what I call neo-reform. And I said neo-reform because I don't just mean the reform movement itself, but I mean an approach to Jewish texts and tradition, which basically says, if we come across a text or a passage that doesn't accord with how we understand social identity or sexual orientation or politics or the world in a broader sense, like we discard it, we reinterpret it. That if the prophetic protest takes Judaism and puts it out into the street in terms of like visible Jewishness and protest, then neo-reform takes politics and brings it into like the shul and wants the practice of Judaism to be in complete accordance with religious practice. And the fourth option or potential path is what I call separatist orthodoxy. And I don't want to just say it's not just Haredi orthodoxy. It's not just, it's like there's this new thing developing, I think, in the Orthodox world that is a kind of like self-consciously anti-liberal form of Jewish identity that holds American society in some ways at a distance. Like it doesn't want to be part of the mainstream American society and understands that its values are different from American mainstream society. But and this is what I talk about in the Trump in the section of about orthodoxy and Trump, is that, but then there are these other ways that kind of like integration into American society has kind of happened, and maybe a symbolic way. Like we can argue whether it's actually Americanization or not. But on the other hand, like the great advantage that Orthodox communities have above all of the other paths that I delineated is that one, the separatist Orthodox kind of communal synthesis is not the same communal synthesis as the post-war one, and so it's thriving as the old post-war consensus collapses. But there's also, and this is more true in the Haredi world, like there's a robust institutional thick communal support welfare state almost that you can live your whole life in a kind of total Jewish experience. And I think there are really only two places where you can live like a life that's like totally Jewish, where like your barber is Jewish, the supermarket is Jewish, and the newspaper is Jewish, and the bus driver is Jewish, and the plumber is Jewish, and like that's probably in like some or like Haredi communities and also in Israel. Like if like that, those are the only two places really where that total Jewish experience is possible, I think. So those are like the paths.
Yeah. When you're in that path, when you're in that world, it feels the best. It feels utopian. And then when you leave the world, you ask yourself questions like, if there's no gay people, is it really utopian?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. If your world is so small and so limited, and your ideologies are so rigid, is that really utopia?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think that one of the things that I regret not writing in the book, but it's come up a lot in conversations with people, is that I think that, I mean, at the end of the book, I also make a kind of a pitch for non-Orthodox Judaism to rediscover the logic of obligation and to think less in terms of individual choice and what feels good to me, and to think of Judaism more as a normative framework of obligation. But what I should have stressed more in the book was that there's kind of been like a mutual agreement between, let's say, like liberal strands of Judaism and Orthodox strands of Judaism, that obligation and inclusion are mutually exclusive. That in order to have this like fully encompassing utopian um, form of Jewish life, you have to exclude gay people. And like in a weird way, both some of the people in the like in the separatist world of Orthodoxy and also people in like the liberal have agreed that that's the case. And so on the liberal side of it, like, well, I don't believe in obligation because the tradition is, you know, it is homophobic and it is so chauvinist. And then you have, you know, some people on the, you know, the Orthodox who says, yeah, like it is, it is those things. And I think that I think like the most interesting projects that I talk about in the book, or endeavors being undertaken in Jewish life, are the places that are trying to merge both commitment to Judaism as a normative framework and inclusion together. It's a very kind of generative thing to try to do. I don't think that these things have to be mutually exclusive, even if kind of they're on each side. There's been this tacit or not so tacit kind of consensus of opposition,
Right.
you might say.
And some people will say like that will never work, you know. And I would respond to that, define work. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you mean?
What do you mean it's
when you
never going to
respond?
work?
Yeah. What do you mean?
You're trying to say that in 150 years from now, kids won't be like passing down rabbinic ordination from that thread of America. Who cares? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Um, you know, if it works for people, it works. You know, it
Right.
works now. It works. Yeah.
Right. There's no reason why like keeping Shabbos has to be accompanied by exclusion of gay people. Like there's no like that's not true. Like there are people making the case for that. It happens to be the case that there's that, you know, there are two sides that have kind of accepted that it has to be the case that way. But I don't, you know, I reject that it has to be that way.
I yeah. I'm very grateful to anyone who does an interview with me. Um, Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, I do these interviews and I'm very um I'm in a lot of agreement. I usually interview people I agree with, but sometimes I don't. And you know, people who agree to go on these interviews, they open themselves up to surprise debates, you know, unexpected stuff, you know. How has that been for you? I mean, writing such a controversial book. I'm not going to say any names. I'm not going to say any specific examples, but I watched some of your past interviews and I feel like you may have been through some of that without giving any specifics.
There
Um,
was really only one that was really crazy.
it was crazy and it was magnificent and it was wonderful and it was one of the best YouTube videos I ever watched. But um, it was crazy also. It was really crazy. And it was also so amazing because it's an experience that I can relate to in my own life. But you put yourself out there, you write a book, you interact with all sorts of different people in different settings. And it's a book that which we've talked about as being controversial, doesn't play to any one set of cards, doesn't play to any one single ideological hat. Um, what's that like? What's that been like? And even if you can put aside the book, just in your own life, how do you think about your own belonging in community where there is sort of disagreement? You know, a story which I mentioned to you in an email, which resonates with me, is this, you know, short story by Ursula K. Le Guin, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. You know, it's this question of when do you walk away from a community, or yeah, how do you think about these questions of where you fit in, where you slot in, and how you deal with the tension that arises in any community, you know, in any serious, you know, thinking of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things. I mean, I like that story a lot. I think about it all the time. I think that there is you know, there are two ways of reading it. One is to be say like only certain communities have the problem of omilas, and then when you leave, you maybe go into another community, you find one that doesn't have this problem. And I think there's a way that like that's kind of what Le Guin, knowing also about her politics, like might think that at the end of the path, at the very end of the story, like you, if you will keep walking on it, you'll end up in a place where this problem doesn't exist. But I think that if you spend enough time, whether moving through them in your own life or reporting, you know, in my sense, a little bit of both, like both moving through them and also reporting, you realize that like every community has that problem. It takes different forms, but there's no community that doesn't have some degree of kind of a foundational problem in it. And um, and once you know realize that, it can be a little disappointing at first, but I also think it opens up to like actually a mature relationship to being in community. In other words, like yes, they have problems and you have to work them out. I mean, the I there are some, you know, some of the times the disagreement that I've, you know, encountered is uncomfortable. One of the things I wanted to do in the book was one, argue that we actually need more disagreement. One of the reasons why American Judaism ended up in the place that it has ended up is that for a long time there was a fear of touching on difficult subjects and disagreement, and there was an emphasis on a kind of fake or manufactured consensus, or a highly maintained consensus, and that actually did a detriment to American Jewish life, because a community that argues over things is a vibrant one. There was an essay. I don't remember where it was published. I thought it was in the Jewish Review books. When I looked for it, I couldn't find it. Someone made an argument that, like, why? I mean, and this isn't the only reason, and I mean, and that I think this is the case. But like, why are the debates about Israel in America so vociferous? It's like there are lots of differences of opinion over other things in American Jewish life, or in theory there are. But there's something about Israel that like brings people to a kind of like frothing at the mouth, like anger and hatred of the people with the differing opinions. Um, that seems like disproportionate, considering that we don't live in the country like Americans. And I mean, I'm talking to you from Tel Aviv, but in theory, we don't live in the country. And the answer that this rabbi, I think he was a conservative rabbi, said is like, this is actually the last thing that people really care about. You know, issues of like there aren't a lot of there were in the past, you know, big arguments between orthodoxy and the liberal streams over conversion, over being like working together in the same kinds of organizations. A lot of the theological issues and arguments have basically been dropped. They've been won because like the community, the Jewish world, and in the book I try not to use the word Jewish community to refer all encompassing, because there are lots of different Jewish communities, but that like different kinds of Jewish communities have basically agreed that like they can't agree on anything, and in that way they kind of stopped talking to each other. Like there was a, you know, in the 80s there was a crisis over, oh my god, what does it mean that Orthodox Judaism doesn't won't recognize non-Orthodox conversions as their way? There was an attempt to build like a cross denominational like conversion beit din to like deal with this problem. Today if you said that to like non-Orthodox people, like rabbis, would be like, we don't care at all. And you know, and that might be like it's interesting because like Israel in some ways is like the last big intra-communal source of conflict. But yeah, I mean, the last thing to like another thing I'll say related to what you brought up is that one of the conclusions that I came to over the course of writing the book, and the kind of the process of being every day writing about Jews and Jewish identity and Jewish history and Jewish texts, and it was the feeling that if when I was younger, my reaction to my criticisms of certain things in Jewish communities, whether it was support for Israel's policies or different things, like made me want to leave, I realized that actually it's like the harder thing to do, but maybe the ultimately more fulfilling and maybe more impactful one is to stay in and fight it out and to argue and to have those arguments, even if they are crazy, with people who, you know, I don't share anything in terms of like morals or values, but other than maybe like a certain kind of commitment to Jewish people and to like Klal Yisrael, and even that might be the only common ground we have. But I think that I think there's something to be gained in sticking it out and just and fighting through it, as uncomfortable as it might be.
I totally respect that. I think that's beautiful. I'll say that, you know, one of the things I grew up with within the Jewish world, and maybe also within like the American conservative right-leaning political sphere as well, is this very strong sense of good and evil. This very strong sense of good guys and bad guys. I think also like it could be endemic to a certain strain of American politics. Also, growing up in the aftermath of the Holocaust with the Holocaust trauma. And what strikes me a lot about Ursula K. Le Guin's short story is she goes through this whole narrative, and there's no evil. There's no questions of good and evil, because when you're making these calculations, you know, protecting your utopia, protecting your people, causing suffering, torturing other people, when you're from far away, from a blurry distance, you might say, oh, that's good, that's evil, whatever you want. But when you're up close, you just see it's just people making human calculations. And who's to judge? You know, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but it doesn't have the same severity that warrants like the word evil, you know? And this question of walking away is not like one of moral condemnation at the end of the day. It's just one of like, I can't stomach it. It's just not, it's just there's something toxic about it. And so that to me resonates when I think about my own questions of communal identification, where I don't inhabit a space of strong moral condemnation anymore. I don't inhabit a space of
Mhm.
this is right, this is wrong, this evil is good. It's a question of, what can I endure? And so that's personally my own sort of uh application of that story into my own questions of, where
Interesting.
do I and do I not sit?
Do you
So
feel like you sit in one specific, like one community? I mean, one of the things I write about is like I kind of you like I have a foot in different communities. Like I think that, and then I think that's kind of the way that a lot of us will start to live. Is there's not always going to be like one place that's all encompassing anymore. Of like,
I grew up in the modern Orthodox Jewish world. I went to Orthodox Jewish day schools, and I went to yeshiva in Israel. I studied in Israel, and I was very, very Zionistic and Orthodox. And it waned slowly over the years. And recently, in the past year, I've had increasing experiences where I felt like these are not spaces that I want to inhabit anymore,
mhm,
increasingly. And so certainly I have a foot in multiple worlds. And I have I think like you do, and you talk about in the book, definitely a foot in multiple worlds. I can wear many different hats. But this question of walking away has felt salient because not from a place of condemnation, not from a place of what's right, wrong, good, evil, from a place of like, what do I feel comfortable, you know, just interfacing with, you know.
totally, totally. Yeah. No, I mean, I, the book in some ways grew out of that question of, or that grew out of that process of walking away from one particular kind of community of like the intensely, like I grew up in like the more of like affiliated capital C conservative movement, and where I think because it was less religious was also like relied on Israel for everything. And then once it was like, well, what does it mean that Israel is not is like doing things that I find like morally unacceptable, but everyone's celebrating them. And like that initial like walking away actually ironically took me back to Israel lots of different times and all around and but yeah, I mean, and I think people over the course of over the life course, their own life course, like the threshold for when to walk away and when not and when to stay changes. Like I don't have kids, but as my wife and I think about having kids and starting a family, then it's like, well, you have to send your kids to a school, and that's going to mean stomaching probably things that are hard, like you said, with your kid too. And like the question is, there are things that you gain from sticking it out, but there are also obviously things that you lose, and it's a kind of like constant self analysis and equation of is this actually still, like at the end of the day, do the pros outweigh the cons? And it's a really hard question. I think in America it's like the hardest. It's for if you want to like raise a Jewish family in Jewish community, like it's the hardest question. Like what, and it's sad too to think about it. Like, there are some people obviously who are make these decisions and are like, here's what I want and here's what I want. Here are all the positives and here are all the positives. Like all the people I know, and I think a lot of for like thoughtful and critical people, the question is often like, well, what can I stomach? What's like the least bad version of the thing that I might get? Like maybe it's, if you're in New York City, it's like super affluent, crazy culture of wealth. And so you have to stomach that if, for education. Or in some places it's like extreme right-wing politics, or in other places it's like closed mind, like anti-intellectualism and closed-minded to, thinking about the texts in a certain way. Like all of these things are in the panoply of questions that you have to ask and think about. Like, can you endure or not, as you put it.
Yeah. All right. Tablet Shattered by Joshua Leifer, The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life. I recommend this book to anyone. Even if you have no connections to the themes of the book, you would at least get a brilliantly written, brilliantly organized, thoughtful piece of history. I think anyone would benefit and enjoy and be able to yeah, really, really gain and sink their teeth in and debate with internally and externally. So thank you so much for the book. Thank you so much for your time today. I really, really enjoyed this discussion. And yeah, and all I can say is I'm so grateful. Thanks a lot.
Likewise, thank you so much for like the effusive praise of the book, and I really enjoyed talking with you. It was great. Thanks so much for having me on.